Dr. Garrett, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. When you talk about this phrase, asymptomatic carriage, what exactly does that mean?
Good afternoon, Steve, and also your viewers, and a happy new COVID-free year to all of you. So what we basically describing here is you also already alluded that it may be a slightly milder disease, so we're seeing less deaths and less long-term hospitalizations with COVID. And what we discovered in our studies, this is just to say this is preliminary data, that there are many people out there with COVID that don't know that they have symptoms, and they therefore don't know that they have COVID. We think that they potentially are still infectious because we know that they have a certain high viral load, so potentially that may be a problem in terms of transmission.
How do you actually do this kind of research? I mean, how do you work out what is actually going on?
So many of your viewers may remember the Sisonke trial amongst the healthcare workers where we vaccinated about 500,000 healthcare workers. And we did a smaller Sisonke study at the research sites where we followed up 1,000 people getting the J&J vaccine very carefully. And we were monitoring for COVID infections more closely in that cohort. And more recently, we started the Ubuntu trial, which is a study that provides people with HIV, living with HIV, but also without HIV, the Moderna vaccine. And when we give vaccinations, we usually check for symptoms. And what happened in this case is that we enrolled 270 patients in early December during the Omicron wave into the Ubuntu trial. And we assessed them for symptoms, and we didn't detect any symptoms, but we also tested for COVID at the time. And we discovered that about 31%, so almost a third of those participants had COVID-19 at the time.
So, I mean, I don't mean to interrupt you. Is this because of vaccines, or is this because of the new variant?
So these individuals have not had vaccines yet. We saw a high rate, so we also looked for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies, so that would give you an idea whether someone had previously been infected. And we still saw a 30% proportion being infected with COVID-19. So just to give you an idea, if you compare that to previous trials that we've run, like let's say last year during the Beta wave or the Delta wave, we used to see about 1% of people having SARS-CoV-2 at vaccination. So this is obviously a snapshot, so preliminary data, and I think our focus will now be on getting more follow-up data on these people in order to, it is possible that they develop symptoms later or perhaps very mild symptoms that they didn't even notice. But I think this is important because many of us have realized, I think, at family dinners or even at work that it is much more difficult these days to know who's got COVID, and it may not be that they have symptoms at the time.
So what does it tell us then about Omicron? Does it tell us, I mean, we know genetically, we know the genome and all the rest has been sequenced. We know it's quite different from other variants. It had more mutations. Do we know why it behaves like this?
So I think the epidemic is now, we're 2 years almost into the epidemic. And you know that in South Africa, up to 80% of people have now had COVID at least once. And then on top of that, about 40% have been vaccinated. So we obviously keep wanting to increase that number. But that puts considerable pressure on a virus. So if there's already such high level of immunity in a population, the virus is then forced to evolve. And we see with Omicron, which has more than 50 mutations, that sometimes some people say towards the end of epidemics, the virus does these things, that it almost hypermutates due to the immune pressure.
So, go on.
Yeah.
So is it mutating then as a virus does? As I understand what a virus wants to do, I realize it's not sentient, it doesn't think, but it wants to get into as many people as possible without hurting them too much, because if it hurts them too much, it can't move around. So it's doing what a virus does in this case. This is how they go.
So over time, that's ideal for a virus. It wants to have what we call a host, which in this case would be human cells, but it doesn't want to obviously kill the host so that it also survives, because once the host dies, then the virus also dies. So if you look at evolution of other viruses, eventually you get this almost, we call it symbiosis, where viruses become very harmless, but they live with us. That's right.
So what does this tell us about what's going to happen in the future then? And I realize, Doctor, no one wants to, sort of predict the future when it comes to this virus. But does it suggest, could we get another variant that goes the other way, becomes more virulent, becomes more like, I suppose, the Delta variant with a higher hospitalization rate? Or could we get another variant that's more like Omicron than Omicron and actually has a weaker impact on people?
So I think what we learned with this COVID vaccine virus is that we keep getting surprised by it. So it's very difficult to predict whether there's going to be a fifth wave or not. We don't know that. Whether the virus will now stay milder, I think that will be obviously much more favorable. I think in the meantime, we can just keep pushing vaccinations and make sure that everyone is vaccinated and also now receives a booster, because that will then additionally help our immunity and prevent those severe cases that we're trying to desperately prevent, people being hospitalized or even dying from the virus.
So another way of looking at it is the more of us who are vaccinated, the more pressure the virus is under, and the more the virus will eventually have to go away.
Absolutely, that's correct.
Doctor, I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Nigel Garrett is Head of Vaccine and HIV Pathogenesis Research at the Center for the AIDS Program of Research in South Africa in Caprisa.